All right, so it is July 29, and it's the new moon of the 5th month.
In the year 2014.
In the year 2014. Thank you, Teresa. All right, so let's pray and then we'll begin. Heavenly family, a new moon again. Thank you so much. This past month has gone by so quickly, and it's incredible to see what you've been showing us on new moons this whole time over the past several months, and now you have something for us again, Heavenly family. So I want to ask that you make the subject exceedingly clear to my mind, as well as to the minds of everyone here and whoever may listen to the recording of this later. And what you've promised us, Heavenly Family, for these new moons is that you'll give us new fruit, not from any tree, and not just any random new fruit, but new fruit from the tree of life. And so we know, sister, that you are a tree of life, and brother, that you are as well. And so we ask that you give us your fruit to eat and to digest and to make use of the life that is in it. And it's words of life that we all need, Heavenly Family. So please help each person to receive these words, not as the fruit of any tree, but as the fruit of the tree of life, and take it not as a theory, but as a practical reality. So please, Heavenly Family, help us all to understand this as it is in truth and to see the implications of these truths for our own lives. Please send your angels, Heavenly Family, to impress these thoughts deeply upon and into the minds of everyone here. May your love reign. Thank you. Thank you, Father and Mother.
Amen.
In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Hey, welcome, Michael. And Anna, I assume, is there with you. And if Walter is too, hi. We're going to be looking at Psalm 18. And this is an interesting one because, yeah, some of this was revealed back at last new moon, but we just didn't have time to get into it with going through both Isaiah 6 and Psalm 7. But this kind of ties in some of the different things from the past new moons, because in past new moons, we've been looking at the Psalms, and here it is, another Psalm of David for the end. And then in other new moons, we've been looking at different prophecies that have to do with things like cherubim and seraphim and thrones and that sort of thing. And then the last new moon was Isaiah 6 and Psalm 7. So you have both things in one new moon, but this time we have them both in one passage, something which relates to cherubim and a Psalm of David, and kind of bring this whole thing together in one. And it's a long psalm, depending on how you number the verses. There's either 50 or 51 verses. Yeah, so we'll probably won't be able to get into other things that are connected with it that much. Habakkuk 3 is connected with it, though, which, again, Habakkuk 3 was one of those passages from last new moon, which was connected to Psalm 7, as well as Isaiah chapter 6, and indirectly with Psalm 139. But this passage connects, Psalm 18 connects with Psalm 139, Habakkuk 3, Psalm 116 and Psalm 144. And so we're going to probably not be able to touch on Habakkuk 3, but we're going to probably read all of Psalm 118, or not 118, all of Psalm 18, all of Psalm 116, and all of Psalm 144. And let's see here.
Rebecca this morning.
Hey, welcome, Rebecca. Happy New Moon. We're looking at Psalm 18. So let's first get a whole picture of Psalm 18 in terms of the context and what it's about and the rest of that. And again, as with all things, the message is justification by faith. It's the message of the gospel. And that, as we go, we'll clearly see that that is what Psalm 18 is all about. And welcome, Annalisa, as well, looking at Psalm 18. All right, so Psalm 18, just to give a brief overview without reading it, it's a Psalm of David for the end, verse 1, or the introductory verse, which some places isn't counted as verse 1, says, "For the end, a Psalm of David, servant of Yahweh, who spake or sang to Yahweh the words of this song in the day Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." So that's the main thing. That is the introductory verse. Now, in the Targums, which is an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, and it's more of a paraphrase than a translation. It's really interpretive. It's really clear that they were inserting their interpretations as part of the text. So it can't really help us a whole lot to know what the original text said. It can only help us to know how the Jews in the ancient world understood the text. And it mentioned here that he's saying the words of this prophecy, which is interesting because they understood it as a prophecy. And we know from the scriptures that songs are prophecies. So this is a prophecy. It's for the end, for the last days, concerning David and having to do with the deliverance of David from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And we'll expand on that more in just a minute. But what we see as we read the psalm is he basically talks about how Yahweh, he talks about Yahweh and he talks about his goddess. And he talks about how they are his rock and his stronghold and his deliverer, and how they deliver him from death and from the grave and from the wicked gods, and we'll get into all of that. And then there is this deliverance is described as Yahweh coming down to him, and as we'll go, we'll see that the presence of Yahweh, who he refers to as his goddess, actually rescues him from this wicked sea, the depths of the sea, which is also the depths of the earth. And there's a lot of detail in this description of Yahweh. Comes riding upon a cherub or cherubim, depending on the version you look at, and comes and delivers him from this and clothes him with righteousness, and then trains him for battle, and then basically gets into the kingdom being established. So that's a basic overview of Psalm 18, and our purpose is to go and to understand it better. For some of you who have been part of these studies and seen what we've gone through in past Psalms, I'm sure just that overview gives you the basic idea, but there's a lot more to it, and it's important to understand the overall context of it, and the details of it, and what specific lessons we can learn from this. One of the most important things to understand or to take note of is that this psalm is also recorded in full in 2 Samuel chapter 22. Now, this is helpful sometimes when we come across psalms that are also recorded either in Samuel or in Kings or in Chronicles, because it gives a framework for the psalm and gives a broader context. So this is found in 2 Samuel 22, and it gives us the context of this psalm. And so to get a little bit of this context, we're going to read 2 Samuel chapter 21. I'm just going to kind of keep going through this without pausing a lot and without asking a lot of questions, just because there is so much to go through. It's a long psalm. We have to read 2 Samuel 21, and then there's a couple other psalms that we'd like to read in full without going into it in as much detail. So Psalm 21, and I'm going to be reading from, or sorry, not Psalm 21, 2 Samuel 21, and I'm going to be reading from the NET, which is the New English Translation, which is one of the best translations currently available. All right, so during David's reign, there was a famine for 3 consecutive years. So David inquired of Yahweh, and Yahweh said, "It is because of Saul and his blood-stained family, because he murdered the Gibeonites." All right, so there's a famine for 3 years, and the reason why the famine was sent is because of the murdering of the Gibeonites at the hand of Saul and his family. So the king, who is David, summoned the Gibeonites and spoke with them. Now the Gibeonites were not descendants of Israel. They were a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had made a promise to them, or a covenant with them, but Saul tried to kill them because of his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. So David said to the Gibeonites, "What can I do for you, and how can I make amends so that you will bless Yahweh's inheritance?" The Gibeonites said to him, "We have no claim to silver or gold from Saul or from his family, nor would we be justified in putting to death anyone in Israel." David asked, "What then are you asking me to do for you?" They replied to David, "As for this man who exterminated us and who schemed against us, so that we were destroyed and left without status throughout all the borders of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be turned over to us, and we will execute them before Yahweh in Gibeah of Saul, who was the Lord's chosen." Or the LXX reads, "At Gibeon, the mountain of Yahweh." The king replied, "I will turn them over." So again, the Gibeonites, they said, "Okay, the way that you can make this right is giving us 7 male descendants of Saul, and we will execute them," or dismember is perhaps a more accurate translation, "on the mountain of Yahweh, in Gibeah of Saul." And David turned them over to the Gibeonites. And welcome, Walter, looking at Psalm 18. And for context, we're reading 2 Samuel chapter 21. All right, so David agreed to that, and he gives over the 7. And it says, the king, again, who is David, had mercy on Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, in light of Yahweh's oath that had been taken between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the two sons of Aiah's daughter Rizpah, whom she had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite, or Mahalathite. So basically what this is he had mercy on Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, but there was another Mephibosheth who was one of the sons of Rizpah, who was Aiah's daughter, now who she had borne to Saul. So Aiah is one of the wives or concubines of Saul. Rizpah is the daughter, and she had 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. So David took those 2 sons and also 5 sons of Merab, who was herself, looks like, the granddaughter of Saul, and so she had 5 sons. So you had 5 great-grandchildren and 2 grandchildren of Saul, 7 in total, 7 male descendants of Saul. And he turned them over to the Gibeonites, and they executed them on the hill before Yahweh. 7 of them died together. They were put to death during harvest time. The NET reads, during the first days of the beginning of the barley harvest, which is really at the first of the barley harvest is a more accurate translation. The word days isn't there. At the first of the beginning of the barley harvest. So you have first and beginning. So this is talking about the very beginning of the barley harvest, which you guys know what day that begins, right? Grave Sheaf Day. First day of the week following the Sabbath in Passover week. Verse 10 of 2 Samuel 21. Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. Or, another way of translating it, which is equally legitimate, is spread it out herself to the rock. So spreading it out to the rock, or a rock, or spreading it out on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest until the rain fell on them, she did not allow the birds of the air to feed on them by day, nor the wild animals by night. When David was told what Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went and took the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the leaders of Jabesh Gilead. They had secretly taken them from the plaza at Bethshan. It was there that Philistines publicly exposed their corpses after they had killed Saul at Gilboa. And David brought the bones of Saul and of Jonathan, his son, from there. They also gathered up the bones of those who had been executed. All right, so you have the 7 sons and Saul and Jonathan's bones, and they were all brought up. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin at Zelah, in the grave of his father Kish. After they had done everything that the king had commanded, God responded to their prayers for the land. So this is the first part of the context in the history recorded in 2 Samuel 21 that creates the framework for 2 Samuel 22, which is the Psalm of Psalm 18. Now, both of these stories we're only going to get a brief overview of and quickly view some of the principles as to how they relate to Psalm 18. I'm sure there's more as to the details of the typology that is here, which we will not be able to get into, and even more which is not yet revealed. But there's enough to give us the framework of the context to enable us to understand Psalm 18, which is the focus for today. So anyways, what we see here is that the basic part of this story is that there was a famine, and the famine was caused by or it was sent as punishment as a result of the wickedness of Saul and his family, or his household, by unjustly murdering the Gibeonites, which was done out of disrespect to the covenant that Joshua made with them way back in Joshua chapter 9. So we won't take the time to read that, but you guys can write that down, Joshua 9. And so this was done. It was a broken covenant, so this famine was there. So David, he's saying, well, this famine needs to end. There's this problem. Yahweh told me why the problem is there. So I'm going to see how I can amend the situation with the Gibeonites. So he goes to them and says, hey, what can I do? And they say, you can give us 7 of the male descendants of Saul, and we will execute them. So David agrees, saying, okay, Saul and his family executed you guys unjustly, so you will have the justice of executing the household of Saul. So he hands over the descendants of Saul to them, 7 males. And they kill them, and then Rizpah, the mother of 2 of them, goes and basically mourns for the 7. She's there with sackcloth, and she spreads it on rock, and she makes sure that no animal, whether a wild beast or fowl, takes apart these exposed bodies. Notice, they weren't buried, they were just executed and left there. Just like how the bodies of Saul and Jonathan were exposed after their death. And so they were essentially, she just made sure that nothing covered them, and she was going to stay there until it rained, which implies that perhaps she knew that they were killed as some sort of resolve for the famine. And I'll just mention as a side note here, we probably won't get into this anymore, but when it talks about, there's 2 other places in the Bible that talk about people dying at the beginning of the barley harvest, and specifically mention it as being that time. There may be other times when people died during that same time, or relatively at that same time, but the 2 times that mention it as being, quote unquote, at the beginning of barley harvest, and uses that same phrase, is in Ruth chapter 1 verse 22, as well as Judith chapter 8 verse 2. Judith is one of the books in the Apocrypha. So in Ruth chapter 1 verse 22, it also was a time of famine, and Naomi's 2 sons, the husbands of Ruth and Orpah, Orpah, I think, yeah. They died at the beginning of barley harvest, and then that's when Ruth and Naomi went back to the land of Israel. And then in Judith, it was during a time when there was a shortage of water, and Judith's husband died at the beginning of barley harvest. And in all 3 of these cases, both in 2 Samuel chapter 21, as well as Ruth and Judith, in all 3 cases, the death which took place during this time of famine or water shortage took place at the beginning of harvest, and the events which transpired connected with that death is what brought about the ending of that trouble of social turmoil and strife, as well as the end of the famine or water shortage. So it's just I just mentioned those other instances simply for the principle of showing that this highlights that there is a major change in the story to take place. There's a problem, and the deaths at the beginning of barley harvest are like a signal of that problem is about to be resolved. So that's the reason why I mentioned those other stories. So this is what takes place as the first part of the context. So David, again, when that takes place, Rizpah is there. She's mourning. She makes sure when he hears of what's happening with her, he goes and he actually obtains the corpses or the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and then he gets the bodies also of the 7 men who died, and he buries them all. And so then it's like put to rest. It's done. Their bodies are no longer exposed. So that's the summary of the first story, which creates the context. Now I want to quickly read the rest of 2 Samuel 21, because there's another part here which relates to this. All right, so starting at verse 15. Another battle was fought between the Philistines and Israel. So David went down with his soldiers and fought the Philistines. David became exhausted. Now Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, who was, again, one of the giants, had a spear that weighed 300 bronze shekels, which is about 7.5 pounds. And he was armed with a new weapon. And other translations say a new something else. And when I say something else, it's not necessarily a weapon. It actually doesn't specify in the text. It could be a weapon, or it could be a breastplate or armor or something like that. Either way, he had said that he would kill David, but Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to David's aid, striking the Philistine down and killing him. Then David's men took an oath, saying, "You will not go out to battle with us again. You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel," or, better put, that the lamp of Israel be not extinguished, which we'll get to a little bit later. Later, there was another battle with the Philistines, this time in Gob. On that occasion, Sibbecai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of Rapha. Yet another battle occurred with the Philistines in Gob. On that occasion, Elhanan, the son of Jair, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. The staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Also, welcome to the person who just phoned in.
Sister Wilcott, I'm always late.
Hey, Joanne, happy new moon. And also, I'll just mention for you that we're looking at Psalm 18, but we haven't really started getting into the actual psalm yet. We're reading 2 Samuel chapter 21 because it gives the background or the context of Psalm 18. And the reason why is because 2 Samuel chapter 22 actually has the entirety of Psalm 18 right there. So that's what we're looking at. All right, so verse 20 of 2 Samuel 21 says, "Yet another battle occurred in Gath. On that occasion there was a large man, or a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was a descendant of Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimeah, killed him. These four were the descendants of Rapha who lived in Gath. They were killed by David and his soldiers. And that's the end. So basically, within this context, we have two things. We have this story of the execution of the 7 sons of Saul, or 7 male descendants of Saul, to amend the wrong done to the Gibeonites and bring back, or basically correct the famine. And then we have this story of the slaying of the giants. So then when we read either 2 Samuel chapter 22 verse 1 or the first verse, or otherwise known as the introductory verse of Psalm 18, we can understand what that is talking about a little bit better. And that is, of course, for the end, a Psalm of David, servant of Yahweh, who spoke to Yahweh the words of this song in the day Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So you see there, okay, the day he was delivered from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Okay, so you have Saul, which is Saul and his household can be included there, and all his enemies, which includes the household of Saul as well as the giants. So we can understand from the context of 2 Samuel chapter 21 what is going on a little bit better in Psalm 18. So of course we know it's for the end, which shows that the things which provide the context and the psalm itself have some sort of symbolic or antitypical meaning, which can help us to understand the psalm itself. It's for the end. It's not just referring to the historical context. It's a Psalm of David, which is showing again that it should be fulfilled at the time of the restoration of the tabernacle of David. And it's a song, which is a prophecy. Now, it's a song of deliverance or salvation from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now, it's not just a deliverance from all his enemies, but from the hand of all his enemies. There is a difference. Now, what does a hand represent? You guys will know this. For the sake of time, I guess I'm just going to mention it. Yeah, everyone's on mute.
Prophet.
He's a
Writings
prophet.
of the prophet Rebecca.
Okay, so here's the thing. Prophet can be symbolized by feet. A hand symbolizes the message. And it can symbolize the writings, which is a way that the message is conveyed. If you look at the message of a writing. But basically it means a message. But it also means the power of something, right? Like, and the hand of the Lord was stretched out upon them. You know, the power of the Lord. That's the meaning that most people have or think of when they think of a symbolic use of the word hand. Now, those two things aren't actually opposite symbols from one another or even incompatible. They actually go together. And I'll just give an example of this. The hand of the Lord, in terms of the message, would be the gospel, right? The hand of Yahweh, the message of Yahweh is the gospel. Well, what is the gospel? Well, Romans 1:16 says the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So the hand of God is the gospel, and the power of God is the gospel. The gospel is the hand and the power. It's the message and the power. So the message and the power are one. So both symbols go together. And of course, when we understand being under the power of devils, this type of thing in Galatians, if you look where he's contrasting the false gospel with the true gospel, he talks about how the false gospel brings people into bondage. So that's some sort of power bringing people into bondage. So power over our minds comes in the form of ideas or thoughts or messages. And so the message of wickedness is the power of wickedness. It's the ideas that enter into our minds that we accept that holds sway over us. So this is David receiving deliverance from the power of all his enemies and from the power of Saul. Now, you'll notice here that I have either Saul or the grave. Why is that? Well, in Hebrew, the word for Saul is Shaul. The word for grave is Sheol. Shaul, Sheol. And in Hebrew, it's spelled the exact same. It's just a difference in vowel pointing. And the vowel pointing was only added by the Masoretes hundreds of years later. And welcome, Princeton. We're looking at Psalm 18. And so it could equally be translated as the hand, from the hand of the grave, or the power of the grave, which of course is death. Both meanings are actually true. Lots of times when the Bible is written where there's a word that could either be one word or the other, and it makes sense in both, it's like that intentionally to convey both messages. Because here, in the context of 2 Samuel chapter 21, it makes total sense to say, from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. But in the context of the psalm itself, or 2 Samuel 22, it makes sense to say from the hand of the grave. For instance, read verse 4 and 5. The waves of death engulfed me. The currents of wickedness overwhelmed me. The ropes of the grave encircled me. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress, I called to Yahweh, and to my goddess I cried. From his temple, he heard my voice. And then later it goes into how he was delivered. So here he's talking about being engulfed by death and encircled in wickedness, and the ropes of the grave tightening around him or encircling him and being prevented by the snares of death. So in that context, it makes perfect sense to translate the introductory verse as delivered from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of the grave, right? So both points are true. The lesson to learn from this is that all these things didn't take place at once, right? Those two stories in 2 Samuel chapter 21. You had the whole instance with the famine and the 7 men dying, and then you had a number of battles which came after that where the giants were killed off. So after all that, David, looking back over it all, writes this song or this prophecy. And he's using those events and the things which took place on the visible human level to look into what is going on among the unseen, or with the unseen beings. And so he's going and looking with what we can see and showing us that which we cannot see, and showing that it is just as real. So, again, through the victory over the famine and over the house of Saul and over the giants, he's seen the victory over the unseen forces. and specifically over the power of the unseen forces. Which, let me just ask, what does it mean, or what would we call that, when an individual is delivered from the power of death and the power of all their enemies? What would we call that? Rebecca says salvation. Amen. Salvation. Or deliverance, which is what it says, in the day Yahweh delivered or saved him from all these things. So this is salvation. This is deliverance. What's another thing that we call that? To be saved from the power of death is to what? Yeah, Leroy typed it in. Justification. Justification by faith. So that's what we have here being pictured. And it's pictured in very dramatic ways. So this is yet another story of justification by faith. Of course, in the immediate context, applied to David, but it extends to all who are willing to undergo that same experience, as we've learned in many of these Davidic Psalms. And another way that we know this is that Romans 6 tells us that if we obey sin, we are under the dominion of sin and under the dominion of Satan. John 8 also says the same thing. So to be freed from the power or the dominion of wicked gods, you know, they are our real enemies. When we read Ephesians 6, we know that we wrestle not against principalities and power, or we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places. So, delivered from the power of all the enemies, that's what's going on. And the only way is to be delivered from sin itself. So this is all brought out in the types here and in the psalm itself. So the children of Saul are seen as the children of death, the descendants of death, or the grave, right? Those who are dead in trespasses and sins. So David is delivered from the power of the children of the grave, the children of death. Because Saul and Sheol, Saul and the grave are seen here as being the same. David is using one as a symbol for the other. So the offspring or the descendants of death, the descendants of the grave, the descendants of Saul, are these 7 men who were killed. So again, that's the one aspect. But then the other is we have the killing off of the giants. Now, if the book of Enoch is true, and not just the book of Enoch, but a lot of other apocryphal literature, which is quoted in the New Testament, and the ideas are spoken of clearly in 2 Peter and Jude. If that's true, then the giants came about as a result of the activity of the wicked gods, and are even, according to the book of Enoch, the descendants of these wicked gods. So in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 21, we have 2 sets of descendants, the descendants of wicked gods and the descendants of the grave, or the descendants of death. Both are there, and both are slain. Both have their power taken from off of David. So we see that the picture here that David is giving is that by having victory over the descendants of Saul, the descendants of the grave, he has victory over the power thereof, and thus the grave itself. And by having victory over the descendants of the wicked gods, he has victory over the wicked gods themselves and their power. In other words, David uses the events of 2 Samuel 21 to picture or to remind himself or to prophesy the gaining of victory over the power of death and trespasses and sins, and over the power of wicked gods. Now, the victory over the grave happened on the day that the wave sheep was offered, the beginning of barley harvest. Now remember, those 7 sons of Saul is the grave. They are children of the grave. So when they are put to death, the grave is put to death. And they're put to death on the day the wave sheaf was offered. And this was intended to give an interpretation of the meaning of the wave sheaf offering. And thus, it foreshadowed Christ's victory over death upon Resurrection Day, which again was the day that the wave sheaf was offered. This is also shown just in the symbol of the harvest itself, because you're going from a time of no harvest, the harvest of the former year was done, and now they're in a, so to speak, natural famine, a time where they're not reaping, and they then come to the place where, okay, that period of death is now over, and now we're into new life. Now we have harvest beginning again. So the symbol of the harvest itself shows that. This story of 2 Samuel 21 is exemplifying that, and all of it is foreshadowing the victory that Christ would have. But again, we learn that Christ, as the wave sheaf, was also a type or a prototype of another wave sheaf in the latter days. So in its finality, this is talking about the bringing about of the wave sheaf for the living. When they have victory over death, over the grave, when they experience justification by faith. Okay, Teresa was asking me to define prototype. When it was like this, yeah, to define prototype. Now, what a prototype is basically a first working type. So you have all these types, and basically a type is just a symbol or a ceremony or something picturing. It is a picture of something to come. So prototype is like an active working type. And so that was going on. That's what was going on in the time text. And so this is, again, giving us this whole context. That's the basic idea of how the context of 1 Samuel chapter 21 creates the backdrop for Psalm 18 and informs us of the meaning of it as being the victory over death and the grave. And we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics in a minute, but we want to read a little bit into Psalm 18 first, and it'll bring us back to certain aspects. So again, Psalm 18, for the end of David, servant of Yahweh, who spoke to Yahweh the words of this song in the day Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, or from the hand of the grave. And he said, I love you, Yahweh, my strength. Now, to start off, he says, I love you. Now, we love him because he first loved us, right? 1 John 4:19. And this also brings us to another psalm that parallels this, which we're going to read in a second. But he's talking about how he loves Yahweh. So, of course, Yahweh has put their love in him for them. And then he says, my strength. And what does it mean for Yahweh to be my strength? Well, in verses 32 and 39 of this chapter, which we'll get to, it talks about how Yahweh clothes him with strength. So 32 says, the God, Ha'el, clothes me with strength and makes my way blameless. then verse 39 says, you have clothed me with strength for battle. You subdue those who rise against me beneath me. So,
okay, I wasn't following along the way you're reading that. I point out where you are.
I said it's not on the screen right now.
Not on the screen.
Yeah,
okay, well then, would you reread that again, because I was confused the way it was read, whether it was a request or a statement.
The last part?
Yeah.
It could be translated either way, but the way that it's translated here is as a statement.
Okay. Would you read it again that way for me, please?
Or sorry, as a request. You subdue those who rise against me beneath me. Subdue them beneath me.
Okay, so it's stated as a request.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's not relevant to the point that we're looking at quite yet. First, it's the aspect of being clothed with strength, because the first verse says, I love you, Yahweh, my strength. And then we want to understand what it means for Yahweh to be our strength. And in verse 32 it says, the God clothes me with strength and makes my way blameless. So here, being clothed with strength is, clothing is what?
Character.
Character. Yeah, clothing is character. And to be clothed with strength, the only thing that is really strong is something that is enduring and lasts forever, and that's only truth and righteousness. And we know that it's referring to righteousness because he says, the God clothes me with strength and makes my way blameless. So I love you, Yahweh, my strength is like saying, I love you, Yahweh, my righteousness. Or you are my strength because you give me righteousness. So that is how Yahweh is our strength. And this, of course, Zechariah 3 shows the same thing, receiving new garments. Now, on this parallel passage that I mentioned, Psalm 116, let's just read it now, and then we will get from that a little bit of understanding that we will see how it parallels Psalm 18 as we go. So Psalm 16 says, I love Yahweh because he heard my plea for mercy and listened to me, which that part parallels verse 6 of Psalm 18.
Yeah, Rebecca asked the same question I want to ask. You mean to say Psalm 116? Right?
Yes, Psalm 116 and Psalm 18. I'm sorry if I misspoke there. So, as long as I live, I will call to him when I need help. The ropes of death tightened around me. The snares of Sheol confronted me, and I was confronted with trouble and sorrow. This is paralleling verses 4 and 5 of Psalm 18. I called on the name of Yahweh, paralleling verse 6. Please, Yahweh, rescue my life. Again, verse 6, 7, that whole area of Psalm 18. Yahweh is merciful and fair. Our God is compassionate. Yahweh protects the untrained. I was in serious trouble, and he delivered me. That's again paralleling verse 6, and later in the chapter talking about the deliverance of Yahweh. And here he talks about Yahweh protects the untrained, those who are not yet trained. I'll just point out one of the significant points of this. Later in Psalm 18, Yahweh trains David for battle. But this deliverance from death and the grave and all that takes place before he is untrained, or before he is trained, rather, which is shown just in the order of the verses in Psalm 18, as well as in this direct statement in Psalm 116, verse 6, where Yahweh protects the untrained. And Yahweh protecting, again, that is referencing back to Psalm 18, verse 2, of Yahweh being like a shield and a protector to us. Rest once more, my soul, for Yahweh has vindicated you. Yes, Yahweh has rescued my life, or my soul, from death, and kept my feet from stumbling. which is also paralleled in Psalm 18. I will serve Yahweh in the land of the living. I had faith when I said, I am severely oppressed. I rashly declared, all men are liars. How can I repay Yahweh for all his acts of kindness to me? I will celebrate my deliverance and call on the name of Yahweh. I will fulfill my vows to Yahweh before all his people. Again, that at the end of Psalm 18 has parallels. Yahweh values the lives of his faithful followers. Yes, Yahweh, I am indeed your servant. I am your lowest slave is what it says in the NET. But really it says, I am the son of your maiden. Which, of course, talking about being raised from death here in this context, the maiden of Yahweh is like how Christ was a servant to his Father. He was a servant of God. He is referred to as the servant in passages like Isaiah 53. So the Holy Ghost is a servant of Yahweh. So she is the maiden, and he is the son of the maiden. You saved me from death. I will present a thank offering to you and call on the name of Yahweh. I will fulfill my vows to Yahweh before all his people. In the courts of Yahweh's temple, in your midst, O Jerusalem, praise Yahweh. All right, so that passage has a lot of these different parallels, and as we go through Psalm 18, you will see them. All right, so verse 2, Yahweh is my rock and my stronghold and my deliverer. My God, or my goddess, is how it puts it in 2 Samuel 22, verse 3. It's goddess rather than God, which makes more sense in the context, and also every place here which refers to it in the possessive as my God is actually my goddess. So it would be out of order to have my God. So my goddess is my rocky summit in whom I take shelter, my shield, the horn of my salvation, who is worthy to be praised. So again, a rock is something that is reliable and sturdy and strong. My stronghold, my deliverer, my savior, my rocky summit in whom I take shelter, place of protection, my shield, the horn of my salvation, who is worthy to be praised. A lot of these symbols are very common to us, and they're very self-explanatory in the symbol itself. Now, something that I do want to expand upon just a little bit here is the idea of the rock, and it's not necessarily to expand on the meaning of the symbol itself, since it's quite a simple symbol, but it is to expand on how the usage of this, Yahweh is my rock, relates to the rock as mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 21, where we have Rizpah stretching out her sackcloth to the rock is one way to translate that, which is like pleading with and displaying her mourning to the rock. It's an act of seeking Yahweh, just like how Psalm 51 verse 1 talks about seek Yahweh, look to the rock. You know, it's that same idea. And in reality, she may have spread out a sackcloth on the rock, but both are possible translations of the Hebrew, whether it's using in the immediate context the rock as being a symbol of Christ, and it merely means, or Christ or God, Yahweh, and it merely means that she literally held the sackcloth and stretched it out in her arms toward Yahweh, or whether it's that she spread it on a rock and David is using that rock as a symbol of Yahweh. Either way, the same basic idea is there. And so she's mourning, and she spreads it upon the rock. She will wait upon the rock until the rain comes, and she's there to make sure that nothing comes or nothing tears apart the bodies of these 7 men. Now 7, yeah.
Even though they're already dismembered.
Yeah, they're already dead or executed or dismembered. The word isn't sure. Some translations even translate it as crucified, but it's like dislocated or dismembered seems to be the most accurate translation. But she's there to make sure no animals pick them apart and stuff like that. Now, the 7 sons of Saul, or the 7 sons of Sheol, the grave, 7 is the number of completion. And the offspring of the grave is wickedness. And so this is a symbol of complete wickedness. So at the beginning of harvest, there is victory over death. In other words, death is put to death. And the dead wickedness is exposed. Saul is a symbol of death, because notice, when this happened, David heard of this, he went and got the bones of Saul and Jonathan. Saul is a symbol of death. What is Jonathan a symbol of? Well, Jonathan is actually, you could say, a symbol of life, but more specifically, Jonathan is a symbol of Christ. The name Jonathan itself means whom Yah gave, or whom Yahweh gave, the one who Yahweh gave. And he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth him, so on and so forth. You guys know John 3:16. So this is talking about, okay, getting the bones of death and Jonathan is a symbol of Christ. That needs to be expanded on a little bit to make sense. Also, I'll just mention a couple things about Jonathan being a symbol or a type of Christ. 1 Samuel chapter 18 verses 1 to 4 says, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was laid upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle." So we see here that Jonathan makes a covenant with David, which we know what the everlasting covenant is about, and gives him his robe and his garments, even his sword and his bow and his girdle. So Jonathan loved David as himself, even as Christ loves us as himself. And this covenant, our covenant, is supposed to be made with Christ and in Christ. Giving the robe, of course, is his righteousness. His sword is his word. His bow is his spirit. And the whole armor, again, is further explained in Ephesians chapter 6. And certain parts of it are mentioned later in Psalm 18. So there are a number of parallels there. And there's more things throughout the scriptures as to how Jonathan typifies Christ. So we have Jonathan and Saul. But here it's the bones of Jonathan and the bones of Saul that are being recovered. Both Jonathan and Saul were put to death prior to 2 Samuel 21. So they were already dead. But the death of the 7 sons, or the putting to end, or the death of complete wickedness, total wickedness, in the context of the famine in the time of David, called to mind the death of Saul and Jonathan and their exposed bones. So their bones were still exposed. It hadn't been put to rest. So you had all the bodies, they were dead, but none of them were buried yet. And it's basically meaning that the situation was unresolved, and the bearing of them is bringing a completion to this story. It's like bringing closure to it. So putting an end to all wickedness and putting an end to death, and we want to understand a little bit more of the idea of Jonathan being a type of Christ and the bones of Jonathan. We're told that Christ, when he died, that his divinity did not die on the cross. That was his divine character, his righteousness, and so on. We're told that he became sin for us. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. As a result, he was raised corruptible. In other words, Christ, he was in corruptible flesh, but he was raised incorruptible. So the part that was not raised was corruptibility. Corruptibility was not raised. The power to corrupt him was put to death, and it was forever to remain there. In other words, it's the power of temptation that's being symbolized. So in the symbol of the death of the 7 sons of the grave, or the 7 descendants of Saul, we have a symbol of the destruction of total wickedness, or the destruction of all wickedness. Then in the symbol of the death of Saul, we have the destruction of death, or the putting an end to of death. And then in the burial, the no longer exposing, but the burial of the bones of Saul, we have the putting to end, or the closing up of death. With the bones of Jonathan, we have a burial of the power of temptation. And all of this, even though, again, death and the power of temptation were already dealt with way back at the cross, yet it was, the purpose of it was left exposed, was left unresolved. They were left unburied until the time of the restoration of all things. Because what happened? Well, righteousness reigned in a few of the apostles' hearts, but then the great falling away took place. And then there's the dry bones, and there's time for resurrection. So this is talking about the time when, in the time of antitypical David, the end of total wickedness, the end of death, and the end of the power of temptation, as symbolized by the burial of the 7 sons, Saul and Jonathan, or the bones of Jonathan. So that's what is all being symbolized there. Now, something else to mention is the parallels of Psalm 144 to Psalm 18. I'm not going to read all the various passages, or I'm not going to read the whole of the psalm right now, but I might read it a little bit later, but I might reference some of these verses as we go. Now, I'm just wondering if you guys want to take a quick 10-minute break, because we're already an hour and 15 minutes into this. We could take a quick 10-minute break, and then we could come back and continue on. Because now we've kind of covered the context and the major portions, anyways, of the meaning that we get from 2 Samuel 21 and how it affects this, and then the rest will unfold more naturally and clearly as we go. So I'm thinking this might be a good time to take a quick break, and then we'll continue on. So we'll begin then.